Tov. Let us start today's Daf Yomi, which is Bava Metzia Daf Ches. Today's Daf Yomi is dedicated for a Shmira for the Chayalim, Hatzoah for the Shuliyim, Yeshua for the Am Yisrael on this eighth Sarah. So we're going to start Bava Metzia Daf Ches on the bottom of Zion Amud Beis. So we're going to start on 2 lines from the bottom. So the Gemara says, 2 lines from the bottom, well, that which we've said in the Mishnah, Shnai Mochsim Talis, that we split up a talis into 2. If 2 people are holding it, Yachoku Nami da Amrin, that which we said we split it up, that's L'demei. That's only for the money, meaning to say, we don't actually rip the talis in half, but we just take the value and split it. Because if you're not going to say this, Shnai Mochsim Talis, Achi Nami de Palgi, I've Sedua. If you're going to say that, you just split it. And here they're talking about the contract, because we were talking about 2 people are holding a contract. We're saying we don't tear the contract in half, but we split the value, because we proved this from the case of the 2 people holding a talis. How are you going to split it? How have to do it? You're destroying the talis by ripping it in half. Umar says, well, halo kasha. That's not actually difficult. Why? Because by ripping it in half on top of chesam and aleph, the chazil ketanim. Because that's going to still be able to be used by little children, half a talis. The Gemara says, "V'hadam Rava ma'asetalis musebes chokokin, hachinami de palgila." So the Gemara says, "Well, what about the next case that Rava said? If you have a golden talis, you split it. Do you mean to say that you cut it in half off to do it? You're going to destroy it." The Gemara says, and Tosfos explains that they don't typically make golden talises for little children. So Gemara says that's also not a difficulty. Halakasha, that's also not difficult because the chazil of name malachim. Because if a golden talis that was cut in half would still be able to be used by little princes, that they would still use it. Gemara says, well, from the following, from that which we learned in our Mishnah, Yishnayim rochman al gabe behema. 2 people are riding in an animal. Hachinami de palgila. How are you going to destroy an animal? Havsadua. You're by cutting the animal in half, you're destroying it. And Gemara says, Bishlam Torah makes sense if it's a kosher animal. Chazia lebasar. You could take the kosher animal and split it in half because you could use its meat. Ela tameya, but if it's a non-kosher animal, havsadua. By taking it in half, you destroyed it. Ela tamei. So it means for its value. And hachinami udmei. Also, what we're talking about here is for its value. That's what we mean. So, okay, just to summarize, basically we said we proved from here that from our Mishnah that when it says to split something, it doesn't mean you actually tear the talis in half or tear the contract in half. It means you just take the value of it. So we're on, good morning, Habs, Boker Tov. We're on Ches Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top, actually 7 lines from the top. So the Gemara says, Amar Rami Bar Chama, Zo Someris. This means to say, now, from our Mishnah, he's deriving from our Mishnah, and the Gemara is later on going to discuss on the bottom of our daf exactly which clause from our Mishnah is teaching this. But he says, we learn from our Mishnah, Bava Metzia l'chavero kana chavero. That if you lift up if you find an object, a found object is called a metzia. If you lift it up for your friend, you can acquire it for your friend on his behalf. Now, we know that in general, you can acquire something on your friend's behalf. If it's for their merit. The chiddush here is that even though it's a lost object, because here, by acquiring it for your friend, you're hurting somebody else. So even though you're hurting somebody else, you could still acquire for your friend, even without his knowledge. And he says, we learn it from our Mishnah. He says, we're going to learn it from our Mishnah. And we'll see exactly from where, because he says, if you're going to say, you haven't acquired something for your friend, and again, the word that's going to be the controlling word for the next few days is a kinyan. What does a kinyan mean? A kinyan is the technical term for the formal way of acquiring something. So Magbia Matil Chavero Kano Chavero. That if you take a lost object and you pick it up and say, I'm picking this up for Ruvain, then your friend has acquired it. Ruvain has acquired it. Because if you want to say no, he doesn't. Then we're going to say that this object, which you're both grabbing, is Kamisha Munachas al Bekarka, Vizuka Misha Munachas al Bekarka. Meaning to say, if we assume as follows, that in the case where the two people are lifting it up, each one's holding half, that since you're not holding the whole object, and he's not holding the whole object, if half of it would still be on the ground, nobody would have acquired it. The whole thing needs to be lifted up in order for it to be acquired. So therefore, we assume that you're lifting it up and you're saying, and the other part is so my friend could acquire it. Because otherwise it would be viewed as though it's on the ground, and then neither one would have acquired it. So we must be from here, Shema Mina, Elav, Shema Mina, Magbia Metzia Chavero, Kana Chavero. On top of 8a, around 15 lines on top, we see from here this principle. That's what Rami Bar Chama says, that if you lift up if you find the lost object for your friend, you can acquire it. Says Rava, no. He says, actually, I can really even say to you that if you find the lost object for your friend and you try to acquire for him, you haven't actually acquired it for him. Well, if that's the case, why in this case does it work? Why in this case does it work? Only because we say migu, since the zachil and nafsha. Here, you're not just acquiring it for your friend, you're also acquiring it for yourself. So since you're also acquiring it for yourself, you're also acquiring it for your friend. That's what Rava says. That's the explanation. And he says, Teida, I'll prove it to you. Because if, I says, I'll prove it to you. Rava says, I'll prove to you that the only reason is because since you're acquiring it for himself, you could acquire it for your friend. For the following case, let's say a person would say to his agent, say Vigonovli, Reuven says to Shimon, I appoint you to go steal from me this watch, and he goes and steals from it. Reuven is going to be potter because Shimon stole it, and you can't have a shliach advar avera, you can't have an agency for sin. But if Reuven and Shimon are partners, v'shutfin sheganvu, we have a principle in Shabbos, we learned this in Baba Kama, that if they are partners that steal it, chayavin, then even though if Reuven and Shimon are partners, and Shimon's not his agent, then Reuven would be responsible. My time. Now, isn't it because we say, since Shimon is acquiring it for himself, he's also acquiring it for his friend. Shema Mina. So now Rava says, Amar Rava, Hasha da Amar Samrinin, Hashta da Amar. Since we say, since he acquires it for himself, he acquires it for his friend, Amrinan, we say, Migu, Cheresh upikeach, since we have a case of a cheresh and a pikeach. What's a pikeach? What's a cheresh? A pikeach is a person who's of sound mind, a regular Joe. A cheresh is a person who's a deaf mute. And even though today we know that deaf mutes can be of full intelligence, back then they had no way of communicating, and so they were assumed to be not of sound mind. So, but the rabbi still made a takana that they could acquire something in a darkei shalom, so it doesn't cause fights. So now we have a case. Let's say a cheresh and a pikeach. So a cheresh could acquire something for himself. So, but let's say they picked up Bava Metzia, that they both picked up an object together. Mitoch shekana cheresh, because the cheresh can acquire it for himself. Kana pikeach. So too, the pikeach can also acquire it. So therefore, since he's acquiring it for himself, also the pikeach is acquiring it. The Gemara is going to say that's not possible. The Gemara says, wait, that doesn't make sense. Bishlam cheresh kana. I understand why the cheresh has acquired it. The kamagbele ben das, because who's the one who picked it up for him? That's the person who's of sound mind. The pikeach picked it up for himself and also for the cheresh. So therefore he acquired that part on behalf of the cheresh. So that makes sense. But if that's the case, how has the pikeach acquired it? Look at Rashi says. Bishlam acheresh kani de kamagbo abendas. Larosha sheni utzarach shneim, because the pikeach picked up the other side for both of them. Larosha sol tzad cheresh, and the side of the cheresh, the gabe cheresh mia have agba. For the cheresh, it was the hagba, meaning the cheresh picked up his part for himself, and the pikeach picked up the other part. But the pikeach, how did he acquire it? The guy pikeach have rosh sheik bia cheresh kemunach al gabe karka. According to the pikeach, his side is still placed on the ground because the hagba of the cheresh, when the cheresh picked it up, it only works for darkei shom. It's not a real acquisition. And that's what the Gemara is saying. Ela Amos, we have to say, cheresh kana, the cheresh has acquired it, pikeach lo kana. So you have to say the cheresh has acquired it, but because the pikeach picked it up for him, but the pikeach has not acquired it. The Gemara says, umay migo, and it says, hashad amris migo, amrina migo. That's what Rava's actual statement was. Since we say migo, we say migo. So if that's the case, what's the migo that's being said here? He said, migo the shnei charashim ba'alma kanu. Since if there were two charashim in general that would acquire, hai nami kana. So since there are two charashim in general that one, if they both lifted up together, they could acquire it. So too in this case, where the cheresh and the pikeach lifted up together, the cheresh and the pikeach can also the pikeach can also acquire it on behalf of the cheresh. So the Gemara says, "Hi, my, they're totally different." Imtim tzolomar hamagbia mitzio chavero kana chavero. You can't say just because we said the migo the zachin nafshi zachin chavri that also applies to the case of the cheresh and the pikeach. Two cases are totally different. If you want to say hamagbia mitzio chavero kana chavero, if you want to say you lift up an object for your friend has acquired it. That's hani mili. That's only in a situation to come magbu die to the chaver where he picks it up with his intent for his friend to acquire. But hacha here in this case, the pikeach has picked it up. Haya die to didei kamagbu. Here in this case, with his own intent, he picked it up. Here in this case, it's with his own intent he picked it up. It wasn't a da'atei dechaver. It wasn't for the intent to pick it up for his friend. So the pikeach da'atei didei kamagbu. The pikeach is picking it up for himself. So he himself is not acquiring it in this circumstance. Is it really going to be possible that he's acquiring it for the pikeach? So we must say mitoch shelo kana pikeach lo kana cheresh. So we say no. That is really like this. That Rava is saying because the pikeach has not acquired it, the cheresh has also not acquired it. And if you're going to say ma'ishna mishnei charashim da'alma, well, if that's the case, how come two charashim can acquire if they lift it up together, but here the pikeach cannot, the cheresh can't acquire it? That's just the takana of the rabbanon that they don't come to a fight. But here it's just the opposite. If the cheresh will acquire it and not the pikeach, do you think that they're going to fight? The cheresh is going to say, well, if the pikeach hasn't acquired it, I also won't acquire it. So now we're on 8a, the second wide line. I don't know what it is. 8a what? Which one is it, Hobbs? Which 8a what? 1, 2, 3? Which one is it? On the art scroll. I want to tell Guy the page. 884. So, thank you. So, Amalei Ravacha Braid Rav Ado Ravachi, do you could do Rami Bar Chama Mehecha? Again, what did Rami Bar Chama say? Rami Bar Chama said, we learned from our Mishnah that if you find the lost object, you could acquire, by picking it up, you can actually acquire for your friend, even without your friend's knowledge. So, where does he infer this from? Mehecha, which part of our Mishnah? If you want to say, he learns it out from the first statement of our Mishnah, which says, Shnayim ochsem metalis, two grab a hold of a talis. One says it's all mine, and one says it's all mine. And then they each get half, which means that they're acquiring it, because or else will be as though it's still on the ground, and the third person can come and get it. That can't be that that's the case. Hasam haikam kula shali, v'anag basa kula. There he's not picking it up on behalf of his friend. Each one is saying, it's all mine and I picked it up. I picked up the whole thing. Can't be from there. It's from the next phrase. Zelmar Kulashali, Zelmar Kulashali. Hasulamli. Why would we need the Mishnah to say this one's all mine, this one's all mine? It's redundant. It's extra. Elami Mishnah Yisera, from the fact that the Mishnah uses extra language. Shema Mina Magbiya Metzia Chavero Kana Chaver. We see from here, you lift up a lost object for your friend has acquired it. Gemara says it can't be. Vo Kimno Reisha B'Metzia V'Seif Mekach Hamemkar. It's not. That's not extra. We've established. We did this back on 2b that the first clause was referring to. Actually, 2a. The first clause was referring to a lost object, and the second clause is not extra because it's referring to a case of business. Each one is saying that they're the one who bought it. Ella miseifa from the next clause. Zel markua shali. This one says it's all mine. Vizel marchatzia shali. And this one says it's half mine. Hasu lamli. Well, why would we need it to be done in that case? I mean, Mishnah Yisrael, from the fact that it's extra. Shema mina magbiya metzia. We see from here that if somebody lifts up this lost object for his friend, kana mitzil chaver kana chaver. Gemara says we might do mitzia there too. How do we know it's about a lost object? That's all. Maybe that's also a case of purchasing. And if you want to say even mekach memkar milo and if you want to say if it's a case of mekach memkar, what would be the chiddush? Gemara says it's drich. I'll tell you why we need a chiddush. Because you might have thought to say that the only reason why he was saying it was half is so he's returning a lost object. We potter, and you won't have to take an oath, because if you find the lost object and you return it, you don't have to take an oath that that's all you found. Kamash Malan, no, we say no, he still has to take an oath. Because maybe he's lying. And Savar, if I'll say it's all mine, but then I'll have to take an oath. So I'll say it's half mine. So that I would be like returning lost object and exempt. So that's not the source. So maybe it's the next case. That if there are two people who are riding on an animal, and why do we need that? What's the difference between that and the case of two people grabbing a talus? So why do we need it? So maybe from the fact that it's extra, it teaches this clause that that's also not necessarily the source. Well, maybe it's teaching us the rochav namikani. Maybe it's just teaching us the chiddush that not only is the one who's grabbing the animal and leading it, acquiring it, that maybe the one who's riding it is also a form of acquisition. So it must be the next case. It says in the last clause of the Mishnah, that if the two people grab the talus and they both admit, so there they grab the talus and they both admit under this case, they both admit that they lifted up together, and they're not claiming that one of them lifted it before the other. Then under those circumstances, we're going to say, or there are witnesses that so they lifted together. Cholkim below shvua. There they divide up without an oath. But now once it's talking about even mekach memkar, if it's a case of business, it's obvious if there are witnesses who say that they both bought at the same time that they split it. So it must be to teach us this chiddush of Rami Bar Chama. Bava Metzia must be about a lost object. We learn from here the principle of Rami Bar Chama, Magbiya Metzia Chavero, that if you lift up an object for your friend, Kona Chavero, you can acquire it. If you found a lost object for your friend, you can acquire it that way for him. Rava will say, no, that case is different. It's only because since you acquired it for yourself, you can also acquire it for your friend. So now the Gemara is going to talk about a kinyan, the way you formally acquire an animal. It said in our Mishnah, if two people are riding the animal, and or one was riding and the other was leading it, this one says it's all mine, this one says it's all mine, they split it. They take an oath and split it. So Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, Amar li Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda once said to me, Shamas Mine, or on top of 8b, Shamas Mine, Demar Shmuel. I once heard a teaching from Shmuel, actually Tarti. I heard from Shmuel two teachings with respect to acquiring an animal. And I heard a teaching, one related to a rachav, one related to a person riding an animal, umanhig, and one related to a person who's leading an animal, like he's causing the animal to follow him, leading it. Chad kani, and I heard that one of these ways is a method of acquisition, a valid method. V'chad lo kani, and the other one, says Rav Yehuda, I heard from Shmuel, is not valid. V'lo yadana haiminayo, and I don't know which one Shmuel said is valid and which one said is not valid. So that's a statement that Rav Yosef said he heard from Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Now, Heichi Dami, the Gemara says, wait 1 second, what is this referring to? Ilema Rachov l'chude, Umaneg l'chude. If you want to say it's a simple case where one person is just riding by himself and the other person is just leading it by himself, if he's riding it by himself or he's leading it by himself, how can it be that Shmuel says, I don't know which way is a valid way of acquiring it? Maneg l'chude, Mika Manda Amar Lokani. Is there anybody in the world who says that if you're leading an animal, that's not a form of acquiring it? That is the form of purchasing an animal. If you want to say the lokani el equal meimar the lokani rachafu equal meimar. So if you want to say that it's not acquiring, it's obviously rachav. It's obviously the riding, which would be the way that doesn't acquire it. And so if that's the case, why would Rav Yosef say he heard from Rav Yehuda, who heard from Shmuel, 2 things? He wasn't sure which one. It's obviously the case that leading acquires and not riding. So therefore, the Gemara says, Ella Rachav b'makom manig ibayale. No, we're talking about a case where one person is riding, and one of them was riding on it, and the second one was leading it, the animal. And that's the question: which one is the one who acquired it? So there, do we say my Rachav adif? Do we say that riding it is better? Da toughest part because he's holding the animal. Odilma manig idif. Or do we say the one who's leading it is acquired it, because that's a preferred way to azla machmase, because he's causing the animal to move. Rav Yosef, Amri Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yosef said, Rav Yehuda then said to me, Nichtayanan, let us ourselves look at it. And we learned it from the following Mishnah from the tractate of Kilayim, that we know that we're not allowed to take 2 animals that are different species, and work them together. And that's the prohibition of Kilayim. But it's not just working them together, also other activities you're not allowed to do together with them. Obviously, you can't mate them together. But what about the following? Hamanig. So if somebody leads both 2 animals together, he leads 2 species together, let's say a donkey and a cow, well then he's going to be in violation of Kilayim, and Sofegas Arbayim, and he would get the lashes. Vayoshev bekaron. Let's say he's sitting in a wagon. He's sitting in a wagon that's being led by these 2 different animals. Sofegas Arbayim. The rabbis say he gets lashes there because it's the case of Kilayim. Rabbi Meir Poter as a Yoshev bekaron. Rabbi Meir says you're exempt if you're just sitting in a wagon because that's not a form of Kilayim. And Kayim along Shmuel, the Apech Shmuel, Vatani, the Chachamim Potrin as a Yoshev bekaron. Shmuel came along and reversed it, and he says the person who's sitting in the wagon is actually the one who is exempt. So the rabbis say you're exempt for Kilayim for just riding it, for riding in the wagon. We see from here that the riding, according to Shmuel, is not a valid form of acquisition. Now we learn from here, and that riding by itself is not acquiring it. But and for sure, if one person is riding and the other one's leading, that the one who's leading is the one who's acquired it, not the one who's riding the animal. So then Abai said to Rav Yosef, now the context for this is Rav Yosef, unfortunately, for a while lost his memory. He got sick and he lost all his memory. And Abai, throughout the Shas, is constantly reminding him. So Abai said to Rav Yosef, why did you say that Rav Yehuda said, let us see? Ha, Zimnin Sagin, there are many times, Amartalon, Nichseanan. There are many times when we studied together, you said, let us see. Velo Amraslam Mishmei de Rav Yehuda. And you didn't say that Rav Yehuda said, let us see. Maybe you're mixing up, the implication is, maybe you're mixing it up here. So Rav Yosef responds, Amra Ibra, Udecharanan. He says, yes, the truth is that Rav Yehuda, that Rav Yehuda himself said this. V'decharana nami da'amrilei. And I actually remember it this time. I remember I remember also that I said to him, Heichi pashat mar. I actually said to him, how can you learn out Rachov Miyoshev? How can you say that the 2 cases are the same? Your teaching, Rav Yehuda, was based upon the fact that sitting in the wagon is the same thing as riding a horse. But they're not the same. They're totally different. They're totally different. Anybody who's been in a horse and buggy knows that there's a big difference between sitting in the buggy and riding the horse. Riding the horse, you're actually doing an action, and sitting in the buggy, you can be completely passive. So I said to him, if you're sitting in the wagon, you're not holding the reins. But if you're riding the horse, you're holding the reins. So therefore, you could be in violation. Therefore, it could be a kinyan. Rav Ushmuel, the Amrit Ravayu, and says Rav Yosef, excuse me, and Rav Yehuda responded to Rav Yosef that Rav Ushmuel said to them, Mosera lo kani. And he says, not only that, they both said to me that Mosera, that handing over the reins is not a form of acquisition. And if that's the case, there's no difference between Yoshev and Rachav, meaning to say, you say the reins is not. That Rabbi Yehuda says, no, reins means nothing. So riding is not a form of acquisition, just like sitting in the wagon is not. Our alternative version of this discussion is Ika Amri. An alternative version of the discussion is Amri Abai Rav Yosef, Echi Pasha Mar. And Abai says to Rav Yosef, how do you learn out Rachav mi Yoshev? How do you learn out riding from sitting? Yoshev o tafetz b'mosera. This sitting is not grabbing, holding of the reins. Rachav tafetz b'mosera, but riding is holding the reins. Amrei hachitana idi. This is what Idi taught. Mosera okani, that the reins is not a form of acquisition. And in Marnami, indeed, we learned. Amar. So Rabbi Chalba taught Amar Afuna Mosera Mechavero Kana b'Mitzia b'Nechzei Ager Lo Kana, that if you get the reins from your friend, you've acquired something. But if you lift up the lost object, b'Nechzei Ager Lo Kani, but by a lost object and by the acquisition from a convert, it's not acquired. It means if you get the reins from your friends, that's a method of acquisition. But if you find the lost object in the Nechzei Ager, that's not valid. The Gemara says, "My lasha moser." What does this mean? Meaning to say that getting the reins from your friend works because he's handing it over to you. But just finding it there, if you get it from your friend, then your friend gave it over. But just picking it up, so that's an action. But just finding it by the assets, that does not work. Why? My lasha moser amarava. Idi Asberli, that Idi explained it to me. Ka'adam moser davar chavero. It's like something, but you hand something over from his friend. Bishlama mechavero kani. That it makes sense to say you acquired it from your friend to become moser lechavre because your friend actually hands it over. But by a lost object and by a lost object and by the assets of a convert, man kam moser le delikne. Who's the one who actually handed over to him to acquire it? So therefore, just picking up the reins is not a form of acquisition unless there was an action involved that somebody handed it over to you. Okay, we'll stop here. God, if anybody has any questions, happy to address. God willing, pick this up.